Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel Chess Real Play. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button for weekly deep dives into the absolute chess games in history. Today, we are asking a big question: what happens when India's fearless young Gukesh steps into the ring with the final boss of chess, Magnus Carlsen? Absolute positional warfare on 64 squares. In this epic clash at the FIDE World Cup, Gukesh had the white pieces and was carrying a massive momentum. Meanwhile, Magnus was commanding the black pieces, ready to give a masterclass in endgame squeezing. Grab your coffee, drop a like on the video, and let's jump straight onto the board. Gukesh kicks things off with pawn to d4, but Magnus looks across the board and says, "Let's keep it sharp," and responds knight to f6. Gukesh sets up his solid weapon, bishop to f4, the London system, but Magnus hits back with pawn to b6, preparing to counter his bishop. On next move, knight to c3, and then bishop to b7. On move 4, pawn to f3 and pawn to e6. Both sides are developing the pieces early. Now on fifth move, pawn to e4 and pawn to a6. Now both sides are fighting for central control early. On sixth move, queen to d2 and pawn to d5. On next move, castles queenside, Magnus pins Gukesh knights with bishop to b4. On next move, pawn to a3, bishop takes c3. On ninth move, queen takes c3 and pawn takes e4. Magnus cracks open the center. On the next move, pawn to d5, knight takes d5. On 11th move, queen takes g7 and queen to f6. Magnus offers an immediate queen trade to force a simplified endgame. On move 12, queen takes f6, knight takes f6. On the next move, bishop to e5, king to e7. On 14th move, bishop takes c7 and knight from b to d7. On the next move, bishop to g3 and rook from h to g8. Now the queens are gone and both players are racing to coordinate their minor pieces. On 16th move, bishop to e2 and king to e8. On 17th move, pawn takes e4 and knight takes e4. On 18th move, bishop to f3, knight takes g3. On the next move, pawn takes d3 and bishop takes f3. On next move, knight takes f3 and rook takes g3. Carlsen snacks the pawn and puts direct hit on the white's king side. On 21st move, rook takes s7 and king to e7. And the next move, knight to d4 and knight to e5. On the next move, rook from e to e1 and responds rook to g4. On 24th move, rook takes e5 and rook takes d4. On the next move, rook to e2 and rook from a to d8. We have officially entered a high stakes double rook endgame. Now pause the video right here. On move 34, Gukesh played rook to a2, trying to defend his pawn passively. But analysis engines and Stockfish points out a much sharper alternative. White needed to push pawn to c4 right here by sacrificing the c pawn with rook to g3 and rook to f3. White creates instant active counterplay and prevents black's king from marching up. Passive defense against Carlsen in a rook endgame is an absolute death sentence. Keep that in mind for your own games. Back to the game. After Gukesh, rook to a2, Magnus seizes full control of the board with rook to g5. Look at Magnus' black pawns start to roll. They are marching up the board like a ball of iron. On the next move, rook to a7, check, and king to f6. On 36th move, rook to a2 and pawn to f4. Carlsen pushes the f pawn. Now we are in 37th move, rook to c2 and response rook to g3. On the next move, king to a2 and pawn to e5. Now the e pawn joins the aside. On 39th move, pawn to c4, b pawn takes c4. On 40th move, pawn to b5, now king to e6. Magnus brings his knight straight into the action to guide his pawns home. On move 41, pawn to b6, king to d6. On the next move, rook to b2 and rook to g8. On 43rd move, pawn to b7 and king to c7. White's b pawn tried to be a hero, but Carlsen king casually walks over and shuts it down. On move 44, king to b1 and king to b8. On the next move, king to c1 and pawn to e4. On the very next move, rook to b4 and rook takes g2. Carlsen sweeps away White's defense. And now rook takes c4 and rook to e2. Absolute boss energy, protecting the key square. And here comes move 48. Magnus pushes pawn to f3. Now Gukesh resigns. Game over. Magnus Carlsen forces the hand of the young grandmaster. Now let's analyze why did Gukesh give up. Because White is completely paralyzed. Black's rook on e2 cuts off White's king from the first and second ranks. If Gukesh tries rook to c1 to stop the pawn, Magnus pushes to f2, threatening instant promotion. After rook to c3, Black gets a brand new queen with an effortless win. Unstoppable technique. Honestly, what a masterclass in rook in-game technique. Do you think Gukesh could have held the joy if he played c4 instead of rook to a2? Let me know your thoughts in the comment below. If you enjoy this analysis,